A very warm welcome to our LRQA webinar, Navigating the EU CSDDD. Today, we will deep dive into one of the more recent EU regulations, the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. I'm very glad that so many of you are joining. And as we are already 1 minute past, let's jump right in and start by introducing ourselves. My name is Mareike Thielen, and I'm a senior consultant working out of our LRQA German office.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jasmin Wittmer, and I'm a consultant working out of our London offices.
Before we start, let me just put out a few housekeeping rules. So we will keep everybody muted in order to avoid any disturbances. However, if you do have a question, please put them in the chat box. And then we will have a Q&A session later on where we will be able to answer your questions. Also, just be aware that this session will be recorded, and after the webinar, we will be able to share both the recording as well as the slides with you. So you don't need to take screenshots or detailed notes. Finally, please note that LRQA does not give legal advice, and the explanation given here are based on our interpretation of the legislation. Before we dive deeper into the content, let us briefly introduce ourselves and who we are and what we do. So LRQA is a leading partner of global assurance services. So we have more than 5,000 experts worldwide engaging with our more than 61,000 clients globally. What do? We support these clients really in managing our ever-evolving risk landscape. So we live in a world, and you are more than aware of that, I'm sure, which is full of disruptions, cyber attacks, and also a changing ESG landscape. So especially the regulatory requirements have accelerated massively over the past few years. And we at LRQA have a broad portfolio of services with which we are helping clients navigate through these risks. One of them being assuring assets and management systems. So it means that we help demonstrate compliance, for instance, with certifications such as against ISO standards. Also, we have a lot of clients who face the challenge of achieving product integrity. So this is one for especially the food and the healthcare sector, where our clients are looking out for our audits and certification. Also, we do increasingly face challenges in terms of cybersecurity. Here, LRQA really helps our clients to become more resilient against cyber attacks, and we offer security testing and incident response for our clients here. Jasmin and I, who are presenting the webinar to you today, are part of the advisory team, and our home turf is really the whole topic of ESG services. So this is where you will find the topic of sourcing responsibly and navigating the energy transition. At the moment, we really have two major things that move our clients. One is the big push toward net zero. So everything from carbon accounting, target setting, but also carbon accounting. And then we also have a lot of clients, just like you, who want to understand our changing ESG risk landscape better, especially the one that's moving ahead with the regulation. So here, for the clients who want to dive deeper into responsible sourcing, creating sensible programs that address not only legislation, but have long-term benefits for a better supply chain, this is where we come into play with our consulting services. And the major topic, of course, being today is the regulation of concern, is the CSDDD. So what are we looking at, and what's our goal for today? We have essentially three big things we want to look out for today. One is to really help you understand what are the key expectations of the CSDDD. So who falls under the scope of the CSDDD, what is expected, and what's the timeline. But also to think about how does it connect. So as many of you know, the CSDDD is not the only legislation, but there are others. And there are interlinkages with them, and it makes sense to understand them. In what ways, we will discover a little bit later. And then, of course, as a final point, where do I even start? So implementing due diligence processes can be quite challenging and comprehensive, and often it's not quite clear where to start. So we were going to give you some pointers there. So I think we can jump right in with Yasmin giving us a little bit more introduction into what are the key expectations.
Yes, thank you, Marijke. So let's dive right in to the due diligence obligations under the EU CSDDD. As the name already implies, the regulation expects due diligence from companies. Firstly, companies are expected to integrate this due diligence into their company policies and into their management systems. So this means they're expected to have a code of conduct and to describe their processes for due diligence in their policies. So this really then lays the baseline for the other due diligence obligations. Next, companies are expected to identify and assess actual or potential adverse impacts on the environment and on human rights. So this means companies are expected to think about how they may affect the environment, but also society. The issues that companies are expected to think about there are listed in Annex 1 and Annex 2 of the Directive, and it's a quite comprehensive list of impacts. Once companies have identified their impacts, they're expected to prevent, mitigate, and remediate them. They're also expected to establish a climate plan which aligns them with the Paris goals. This is one of the due diligence obligations which aligns quite closely with CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. We'll dive a bit more into the synergies with CSRD and the differences a bit later in the webinar. Throughout the due diligence obligations, companies are expected to listen to external stakeholders. They have to do this on the one hand proactively, so they have to carry out meaningful stakeholder engagement, but they also have to make available channels for potentially affected stakeholders, but also just generally interested parties to bring forward concerns. So those would be your notification mechanism and your complaint procedure. Throughout their due diligence, companies are also expected to monitor the adequacy and effectiveness of their actions. So they're expected to regularly sort of sit down and think about whether what they are doing for their due diligence obligations is working. Finally, companies also have to publicly communicate on their due diligence and what they are doing. This takes place in line again with CSRD, the Sustainability Reporting Directive. So there's no new format required here, but the due diligence content needs to be integrated in those existing CSRD formats. A quick note on what happens when companies do not comply with these obligations. Under CSDDD, there is civil liability for damages, and there's also sanctions. Sanctions include both a naming and shaming list, the reputational aspects, but also fines of up to 5% of companies' net worldwide turnover. So quite strong sanctions there. Let's look at where those obligations apply for companies, because the scope in the value chain is relatively broad for CSDDD. All these obligations that I just outlined apply to the upstream supply chain of a company and own operations. It also applies to downstream, but it's limited to transport, storage, and distribution, wherever this is done on your behalf or directly for you. So to make this a bit more tangible, let's look at this sample supply chain that's on the bottom here. So this is a t-shirt company that produces t-shirts and then sells them. So for them, the chain of activity, which is the key terminology used by CSDDD, would encompass their entire upstream supply chain. So anything from cotton ginning to cutting and sewing the t-shirt would be in scope of CSDDD. What would also be in scope is anything related to their own company. So any stores where they sell the t-shirt themselves is in scope, but would not be in scope is anything that they sell through a third party. So for example, if this t-shirt is also sold on an online marketplace that's operated by somebody else, this online marketplace would not be in the scope of CSDDD. What would be in scope is the transport and storage whenever it happens from the company themselves. So not from the online marketplace, but if the company themselves has transport and distribution services, then that would be in scope as well as storage. What would again not be in scope is anything that you see on the right-hand side regarding the wearer of the t-shirt. So that person would not be in scope of the obligations of CSDDD, so companies would not need to think about how the t-shirt may affect that person, or anything related to the recycling of the t-shirt, or however the person chooses to dispose of it. So defining your chain of activity and where it ends and where it begins is very important under CSDDD because it gives you the frame to where these obligations apply. We've now looked at these quite broad obligations, so we want to quickly hear from you. Which one of the obligations do you think will be the most challenging for your company to meet? And you can see the poll hopefully pop up on your screen. And do you think the mapping of your chain of activities and this exercise I just described will be the most challenging? Or will it be identifying and assessing impacts, preventing, mitigating them? Or could it also be establishing the climate plan and reporting? I'll give you a few more seconds to vote. I'm seeing the votes come in. I'll give you a couple more seconds. Right, I think we can close the poll. So we're seeing that many of you think that preventing and mitigating impacts will be the most challenging, and I assume it will also apply especially deeper in your chain of activities. That's actually the second response we're seeing here. Many of you think that mapping your chain of activities will be quite challenging, followed by assessing impacts, reporting, and the climate plan. Interesting, thanks everybody for sharing those insights. It's important to note there is still a bit of time to prepare for CSDDD obligations. If we look at the timeline here, the directive was formally endorsed in May and has now been published in the official EU journal. Now member states have about 2 years to transpose these rules into their national law before it begins to apply in 2027. In 2027, the first group of companies will have to apply CSDDD. This group of companies encompasses companies with over 5,000 employees and $1.5 billion worldwide turnover. What's important to note here is that it doesn't only apply to EU-based companies, but also to all companies that generate this level of turnover in the EU. So even if you may not be headquartered in Europe or have significant operations here, if you generate this level of turnover in the EU, CSDDD obligations will be relevant for you. This then also applies to those coming into scope in 2028 and ultimately 2029. So it will be scoped in a phased approach, and from 2029 it will then apply to all companies ultimately in scope. As we already said, CSDDD is the latest in a family of sustainability legislation. We've put a couple up here on this map, which by the way you can also find on our website. We've seen some national legislation, such as in Germany, the German Supply Chain Act, come into force. This one is also quite similar to CSDDD in that it mandates companies to undertake due diligence. We've also seen some action on the legislative sphere in the US with the Forced Labor Prevention Act, but also on the EU level, there's quite a number of obligations which have come into force. We've popped up here the CSRD, the Reporting Directive, but also more specific legislation, such as the EUDR, the Deforestation Regulation. This regulation asks companies not to place any goods or products on the European market if they've been produced under the instance of deforestation. So it's more of a market access legislation. Before we dive into the synergies of CSDDD to all this family of legislation, we again wanted to hear from you quickly. Which legislation you've spent the most time on in the past year. We know that all of you have been likely working on some of these legislations, so we're just wondering which one has taken up the most time. Is it the German Supply Chain Act, also known as the LKSG, or is it the Reporting Directive? We've also put up the EUDR, the Deforestation Regulation, as an option here, or any others, if you don't find yourself in this list here. We'd also be interested if you haven't actually worked on any of these legislations here, and CSDDD will be the first one for you. I can see the votes coming in. I'll give you a couple more seconds to put in your vote. So let's have a look at the results. It seems that most of you are undertaking the most time preparing for CSRD. Next in line, we have the German Supply Chain Act, but also the EUDR. And then some of you are saying that it's other legislations, and CSDDD will be the first one for you. This is actually a great result for us because the two examples we'll deep dive on later are CSRD and the German Supply Chain Act. So we're happy to hear that those are important legislations for you. What we often find helpful is when looking at this family of sustainability legislations is classifying them into these three buckets here. So ultimately, all these legislations more or less aim to improve a company's sustainability performance. However, the mechanism they use to do that is different for each of them. And we've classified them into three buckets here because we find this helpful to understand how they work. On the one hand, we have disclosure legislation. So these are the ones that ask companies to publicly disclose certain sustainability information. So CSRD that we just spoke about would fall under this bucket. Then we also have due diligence legislation, which really mandate action from companies to identify and address adverse impacts. From the name, you can probably already tell that CSDDD falls under this bucket, as does the German Supply Chain Diligence Act. As the last bucket, we've identified market access legislation. So this is where the EU deforestation regulations, for example, would come in. They set out specific criteria that must be fulfilled to place a product on a market. So while those mechanisms are different, they all ultimately have the same aim. And what we would always advise our clients is to look at where they overlap and to develop holistic responses to all of them. So follow one strategy that enables to fulfill disclosure, due diligence, and market access legislation. What we find is important though, before you formulate those responses, is to understand the specific nuances of these legislations and how they align, because it allows you to also identify synergies. We'll now go through two specific examples, the German Supply Chain Act and CSRD, as I already mentioned. And then we can look at the synergies and how they can act as building blocks for your CSDDD preparation. For the German Supply Chain Act, we've identified a number of synergies and differences, but maybe before we dive into it from a content perspective, I want to place a quick note on terminology. Many of these legislations use similar concepts, but slightly different terminology, or the other way around. And what we find with our clients is that because more and more departments are getting involved in the response to those legislations, it's important to be very clear on the terminology you're using for which concept, because it just reduces any confusion that's unnecessary. So for the German Supply Chain Act, it talks about legal positions that are protected, and CSDDD talks about impact. In this particular case, it's relatively clear the same concept is referred to. They both mean the human rights and environmental topics you're expected to look at under the legislation. Where it becomes a bit more important to be clear on the terminology is where the German Supply Chain Act talks about risks and violations, whereas CSDDD then talks about potential and actual impact. And why it's so important to be clear here, Mareike will deep dive into a bit more deeply in CSRD related concerns. But however, for the German Supply Chain Act and CSDDD, they kind of again mean the same thing: potential and actual effects of your company on the economy and society, the environment and society, sorry. So, then, the German Supply Chain Act roughly covers 12 human rights and environmental risks, whereas CSDDD roughly covers 32 issues. So here we talk about impact. I say roughly because it depends kind of on how you aggregate them, but broadly this gives you a sense that the impacts covered under CSDDD are much more extensive. This, however, doesn't mean that anything you've done for the German Supply Chain Act is no longer relevant. Many of the issues actually match between the two, but also any learnings that you have from the German Supply Chain Act on, for example, which data sources are useful for you, which systems you're using, what supply chain information you can gather, etc. So any learnings that you have on the topic level, you can also use then again for CSDDD. One more note is for the value chain scope. The German Supply Chain Act focuses specifically on the suppliers and only on an ad hoc basis on indirect suppliers. CSDDD, we saw, focuses on your entire chain of activities, so it's much more broad in terms of your supply chain that's in scope. But again, anything you've found that works in terms of data gathering on your direct suppliers for the German Supply Chain Act, you can then use for CSDDD and just extend it a bit more deeply into your supply chain. Of course, you'll need to make some amendments, but it can be a good starting point to use. Then there's the concept of the risk-based approach. So under the German Supply Chain Act, you have to identify risks across all your direct suppliers. For CSDDD, you can take more of a risk-based approach to your chain of activities. So you can look at which parts of your chain of activities have the most risk and deep dive there. So you can take a first evaluation, look at which supply chains are interesting or most important to me, and then deep dive to identify and address impacts there. So if we go back to that t-shirt company, they may want to look at their t-shirt supply chain rather than their software distribution and identify and address impacts in their t-shirt supply chain. So this risk-based selection of which chain of activities to focus on is allowed under CSDDD. Once your impacts are identified under both legislations, you're allowed to prioritize them. So you can prioritize which impacts or risks under the German Supply Chain Act you want to address. Both legislations also give a set of factors you can use to prioritize. However, the way you can prioritize slightly differs between each legislation. Under the German Supply Chain Act, you can use leverage, so your possibility to bring about change, business activity, so which type of activity the supplier is undertaking and how that relates to you, connectivity, likelihood, and severity. Connectivity in this instance means how connected you are to the impact. Are you simply linked to it or contributing, or are you directly causing it? Under CSDDD, in this first instance, once you've identified your impact, you're only allowed to use likelihood, so how likely is this impact to occur, and severity for prioritization. The other aspects under the German Supply Chain Act then come in at a different stage under CSDDD. So leverage and connection to the impact come in once you address or mitigate an impact. So once you've identified and prioritized an impact, you can then use leverage and connection to decide on how you want to take action on the impact. The concept of business activity comes in under the risk-based approach, so where you focus your efforts and how that business activity relates to you. So the concepts, again, are the same, but they're applied at slightly different stages of the process and in slightly different ways. So this is important to know because once you look at your processes for the German Supply Chain Act and extend them towards CSDDD, it's important to know which learning can come in and how you can adapt each specific process towards CSDDD. The last aspect I wanted to touch on is documentation and reporting. For the German Supply Chain Act, there's a very specific format of how you need to report your due diligence information to the German authorities, to the BAFA. Under CSDDD, again, this reporting takes place under CSRD. On documentation and reporting, but also on the German Supply Chain Act more broadly, it's important to note that the German authorities have put forward a proposal on how to adapt the Act under this national implementation of CSDDD implementation. So there's a proposal, but there hasn't been implementation of it yet. So it's important to keep an eye out on this, on how exactly it will be implemented. The timeline we can anticipate is that it may already start to apply at the end of this year, this new format of the German Supply Chain Act. But we'll keep you updated via our newsletter, but also on our LinkedIn page. So make sure to follow us there because we can keep you updated on any new developments. That's the piece on the German Supply Chain Act. So let's now go over to a slightly different type of legislation and identify synergies and building blocks there.
All right. So I think now it's then time to look at the next slide and the CSRD and the CSDDD. So a key regulation that we learned many of you are familiar with is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And probably many of you are also familiar with it because it is approaching much more rapidly than the CSDDD. Now, you may think, I will do the CSRD now and the CSDDD I will do in 2 years' time or whenever it applies to me. And this is the compliance perspective that some of the companies take. But if we can give you some advice, this is not necessarily the best perspective that you should take for your business. So please reconsider this point. And being in this webinar and learning about it, I think is already a great sign that you may not be one of those people. The reason for that being is that there are actually multiple linkages that you may want to consider already now. So we put together some of them. It's not an extensive list, but just to give you a taste of what to consider. One is the topic of impact assessment. So when we look at the CSRD, it's of course a key step in the double materiality assessment. So you will have to, as part of the CSRD, perform this double materiality assessment and identify negative material impacts, but also positive ones from your company on the environment and society. But this is not the only perspective you're taking. You're also taking the inward perspective and looking at risks and opportunities from a financial perspective for your company. For the CSDDD, you're also looking at impacts, but major difference, you're only looking at negative impacts, so-called adverse impacts, on human rights and the environment. So the perspective of positive impacts as well as the perspective of risk and opportunities is not included here. So here, please be aware that while you use similar terminologies, you may have very different outcomes in these analyses. And it's also explainable, but make sure that you understand the difference between the concepts already when you go now into the double materiality assessment. Another aspect that's interesting to look at is the impact prioritization. So we learned already that we can work with likelihood and severity for prioritization. Likelihood is rather easy to understand. So the question is always, how likely is it really that this impact occurs or that my company causes this impact, for instance? For severity, it's a bit more complicated because severity asks you how many people are how strongly affected and for how long. And this is also an important opportunity for you to align especially your methodologies. What does that mean? For instance, so when you measure severity, you may use a certain scale. So you can make sure, for instance, that you use the same kind of scale for fulfilling your CSRD requirements as well as for fulfilling your CSDDD requirements. And to educate also the people who are working within the company about the concept of severity is something you will only need to do once. When it comes to taking action, there are also actually quite a few differences. So we called it preventing, mitigating, remediating impacts here. But for the CSRD, you need to report your actions for material topics, but it may also be that, especially in the first year, you may not yet report so many actions. That's a bit different, to be honest, for the CSDDD. So here, it's very possible that you, as part of your process, will identify relevant, adverse, potential, and actual impacts. Once you have done that, however, the degree to which you implement measures can vary. And the reason it can vary is because you can look at, was this impact caused by your company? Was it caused jointly, or was it caused by another business relationship? And if you have caused or jointly caused an impact, you will need to avoid it or mitigate it. That's important to understand, that there are certain obligations connected to it, especially in the CSDDD. And then, of course, later on, you will also have to report on it. There are two major topics that you should be aware of that build major synergies between the CSRD and the CSDDD. One is the topic of climate plans. So in both legislations, you have certain requirements for setting climate targets, setting out a climate plan, putting together a transition plan. So the wording is always slightly different, but the goal is the same. And actually the requirement for the adoption of such a transition plan is the same. So therefore, if you are already now working on having this transition plan, or even have adopted it already, you have already a good piece of work that you can then also use for the CSDDD without having to implement additional efforts. When it comes to documentation and reporting, we have a synergy here once again. What does it mean? So the CSRD, of course, is a reporting directive. So it majorly affects all your reporting structure, and you may also want to adjust your reporting structure now accordingly in what the CSRD requires. When you go about this process, please be aware that you can already think about the CSDDD and what are the requirements behind the CSDDD, because in a few years' time, you will also report the due diligence obligations that you have as part of your CSRD reporting. So there's no requirement for a separate report, like for instance, there is still at the moment for the German Supply Chain Act and to the BAFA, but you can actually use existing reports and report within these existing reports. But please make sure that when you think now about making changes in the structure, you can already think about how does due diligence fit in there and what are good ways to include it here. Those are just some pointers to what you can do. Important message, once again, when you fall under the CSRD and under the CSDDD, please make sure that you do not wait 2 years to get started, but look at both legislations right now and think about what are potential linkages here for your business. And I know there are many detailed words and pitfalls, so always feel free to reach out to us and we are happy to support. There was another big group actually who was not yet concerned by any legislation, and I think it's also interesting to just see how can I even get started, depending on if I have implemented something or was not so much affected by other legislations. That should be the real question. How do I go from understanding initially the legislations to taking action? So when we think about how to get started, there are a couple of things that we always go through with our clients, and we would like to share that with you at the moment, and it may also be helpful for you. So as a first step, we always say it's very sensible to map your environment. So to understand, of course, first of all, is the CSDDD even relevant to me? Is it applicable to me? And if it is, when will it be? So that may be easy, but if you are in a part of a larger, complex company with multiple thresholds on turnovers and employees, it may be a more complicated endeavor. So please don't underestimate this point. And then I think we made this quite clear in the past few minutes. Think about what other legislations are relevant to me. So this is not only important in terms of where can you identify interlinkages and synergies, but also learnings that you can have that you can then transpose into also taking action for the CSDDD. And once you have done that and you understand a bit more of the context you're operating in and interlinkages you have, then of course you have to think about, do I really start at zero at my company? And most companies do not start at zero. So what policies, what strategies are already in place? And this can also be smaller things. So it doesn't need to be a complete due diligence process, but it can also be a certain awareness for points. It can also be that you have an environmental management system in place. Those are all kinds of smaller pointers where you have initial building blocks you can still integrate and extend. Because the ultimate goal in the end is to create due diligence processes that are part of your company, part of your business processes, not create separate processes which do not really interlink with your business. And then think about also, what experts do I already have on board? So what departments are already familiar with certain legislations, with certain topics, and try to not tackle this job alone, but look for allies within the company. And this will really help you then in the end to identify and prioritize gaps. So to really understand, okay, what do I still have to address so my company is really equipped for the CSDDD, and what are really the priorities in terms of timeline and effort. So there may be larger tasks which take more time and smaller tasks which can be implemented rather quickly. And I think this is also something we have learned from the past legislations, these due diligence system, implementing them, establishing them, educating people inside the company is not usually a small feat, but it's a larger task. So please be aware, take some time in advance, and also make sure that you get multiple people on board and that you may have to ask for additional resources. And resource processes in large companies, of course, may take more than a few months' time. Once you have done this, think about setting up a roadmap. So what needs to be done by whom and when to close the identified gaps? So first of all, think about the smaller pieces, but then please do not forget to also think about the bigger chunks, the bigger pieces, and the overall responsibility. So implementing due diligence processes includes having multiple people on board, but we have made the experience in the past with our clients that it massively helps to have an overarching responsibility, somebody who can sail the boat into the harbor, so to speak. And it can really make a difference in the end on how smooth the implementation is at your company. So those are just a couple of pointers to help you get started with the legislation. And of course, this sounds now rather easy, but there may be many pitfalls and open questions which are general to rather specific. So from our side, we say at LRQA, it's a good starting point to take a first step into this diagnostic world, to take on a gap analysis and really understand where do I stand as a company and what do I need to do next. And then depending on the outcome of this, the next steps may be very different. So you may have to start with really mapping out your chain of activities, distinguishing it from your value chain, distinguishing it from your supply chain. You may have to start out with actual measures that you are implementing because you are actually quite advanced already with assessing impact, or it could be something completely different, like thinking about stakeholder engagement or thinking about how to establish a proper grievance process. So we are at LRQA a company who does not only focus on one part, so we are not only focused on risk assessment, but we are really there to support wherever you need the support. We can do end-to-end due diligence with you, taking you along every step of the way, or we can work with you on single pieces of this legislation and connecting it to your overall strategy. So please reach out to us, happy to support on that, and also happy to just give you some final messages and takeaways from today's webinar before we jump into the Q&A session in just a few minutes. So what you should have learned today are some things about key expectations. So it's about identifying, preventing, and mitigating potential and actual adverse human rights and environmental impacts in your chain of activity. We talked about how does it connect. So think about other legislation and how they can be used as building blocks for implementing due diligence at your company. And then, of course, we gave some first pointers to where do you start. We always suggest to start with this classical process of a gap analysis, and we're happy to support along the way if it's in the gap analysis or then implementing due diligence at your company. So I think now we can actually move from here and dive right into your questions.
Yes, there have been a few questions coming in the chat, and also some of you have mentioned that my audio quality is not great. I hope you can hear me okay now. We've had some internet wobble, so I'm actually joined on my phone. Apologies for any connectivity issues there. I'll let Marijke answer the first couple of questions, so hopefully you can hear her well. The first question that came in is whether the legislation is relevant if you're not based in the EU, so headquartered or based in the EU, do you still need to do anything?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. I think we addressed it in the beginning briefly in terms of timeline. So this legislation is not only relevant for companies in the EU. So it's also about whether you're doing business in the EU. So if you have certain turnover threshold, this legislation may as well apply to you. And I think that's an important point to check, that even though it's called EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, it may affect you as a company if if you have business in the EU but are headquartered somewhere.
Another question that came in is regarding the mapping of the chain of activities, which I know some of you also mentioned in the poll is the obligation you're the most concerned with. This person is asking, they don't have any information on their sub-suppliers. They only know about their direct suppliers. How can they go about mapping their chain of activities? Where do they even start?
Yeah, I think that's also a very, very good point. So I think most companies do not have any or not a lot of specific information about anything that goes beyond the tier 1. So anything that goes into the upstream supply chain up to the raw material. And otherwise, I think we would have a different discussion today. But I think it's important to not start out with the details. So initially, you don't have to know each and every tier N supplier in your supply chain, but start rather pragmatically and think about what are key schematic steps to create your products and your services. And this does not need to be already on a supplier level, but it can always start out on a very general level. So you can think about what are key steps. And I think we showed this in the beginning on the chain of activities, also on a very schematic level. And this is also something you can start with and build it from there and identify first risks on a very general level before you dive deeper into certain sections of the chain of activities which you have then identified as relevant. I think that would be my advice to you. So I think we have a couple of more questions here. So one question is if the company is fulfilling the CSDDD, are they then automatically compliant with the CSRD?
I think that's something you spoke about briefly, Marijke, with the differences and the overlaps between the legislation. So CSDDD can help you fulfill parts of CSRD, but of course there's also other aspects that you need to think about, such as the double materiality assessment, looking at any positive impact your company may also have, and all these other aspects you outlined. So while it can help you, it doesn't fulfill the entire picture. We've also, go ahead. We've also had a quick one come in. I'm just trying to find it now. Whether the reporting requirements, 5,007, 1.5 billion turnover, whether that's cumulative or not.
So it's an and condition. So when we're talking about the condition between that you are an EU-based company and when the CSDDD applies to you, and there's always employee condition starting at 5,000 employees, and then there's a turnover condition, and it's always an end condition. So if you, for instance, have only 3,000 employees or only 500 employees but go over the turnover threshold, then you are not fulfilling the same condition. With regards to the chain of activities, there's one question which asks, is the chain of activities the same as the value chain?
No, so your value chain would be anything that's in your upstream, your own company, or downstream. So it will include more than your chain of activities. Your chain of activity is a defined term under CSDDD, which is only upstream, own operation, and then to a very small extent downstream. So only transport, distribution, and storage, wherever that's done directly on your behalf or by your company. So the entire downstream value chain, anything related to what we talked about, the disposal of the t-shirts, etc., would not be in scope of CSDDD. So there's only a certain aspect of your value chain that's part of your chain of activity. And maybe that brings us back to the point about terminology, which is very important when it comes to the different legislations. We've also had the question whether we have any tips on how to start conducting the impact assessment on an operational level.
Yes, so with regards to the impact assessment, I think what's important to understand is that the impacts that you have to assess are listed in the annex. So in some ways it may even be easier than some other legislations where it just talks about general impacts, but the things that you will have to look out for are listed in the annex of the CSDDD. And what you can do then is to think about how can I measure really the likelihood and the severity. So it makes sense then to think about good data-driven platforms or single indices that you can use. So from LRQA side, we have one platform which is called EIQ, which has a huge collection of indices, which will help you to identify impacts, and then also to think about how can I assess the severity of these impacts. So to either think about the concepts yourself or again get some help and get some coaching to think about what does severity actually mean, how do I measure it, and how do I apply it for my company. So I think those are some good first steps, as well as what you can do as well as look at general requirements that have been put out with regards to the OECD, because the CSDDD is actually quite closely connected to the OECD, and a lot of tips and tricks on how to assess this you will also find in the general application for OECD, for the OECD framework. And maybe just one additional thing, I think companies are always looking for guidance, which is completely understandable. And I think something we are also looking forward to is that the EU Commission themselves are going to publish some additional guidance as well, which I think is going to help all involved to get some additional frameworks on this legislation. So we have one more question here. Do you have any recommendation who should own the CSDDD? So should it be legal, finance, sustainability, procurement?
Yeah, that's a question many of our clients actually approach us with. How can we govern the implementation of the different sustainability laws, amongst which there is CSDDD? We've seen this be done in different ways. Some of our clients, the sustainability department will own it and have a very strong steer on how different due diligence obligations are rolled out. So this is, of course, not yet built on experience with CSDDD, but more broadly on other sustainability legislation and what we can learn from them. So we've seen sustainability departments own it and govern it. We've also seen quite successful cross-departmental governance platforms and implementations. This is because the CSDDD obligations will touch many aspects of the business. So we own operations, which oftentimes will also involve, for example, HR, which we haven't spoken about yet, but also procurement, of course, when it comes to the supply chain and sustainability, which oftentimes can bring in more topic-based expertise. What we found is very important when cross-departmental governance structures are found is to very clearly assign which department owns the ultimate responsibility to implement which aspect. This type of assignment of responsibilities, maybe it can be erasing, maybe you can find another method, can be really helpful because it avoids, first of all, obligations simply not being implemented because it gets put on the back burner because nobody's really sure who's responsible. But it also can align well with which department is an expert in what. So HR could own processes related to human rights at own operations and be fully responsible for that, reporting into a governance structure. Procurement could be in charge of collecting any data on your chain of activities, etc. But this clear assignment of responsibilities, what we've really seen as a key aspect in making these types of due diligence exercises work well. So there's multiple ways, but it's important that it's clear who owns what, who will do what, and who is responsible. We've had a number of questions on applicability. So if I don't import anything on Europe, but I sell the goods in the EU, do I have any responsibility? And then also some questions on employees. Maybe we can take the one on the employee number first. The person is asking, is that 5,000 employees in the EU, or is it globally 5,000 employees?
So this is then referring to the EU-based companies, because when you are not based in the EU, it's only the turnover thresholds that apply to you. But if you are based in the EU, it's actually the number of EU employees that apply to you. And then, of course, there are some nitty-gritty information about is it full-time employees or not? How long in the past do you have to go back? So again, I would recommend to really look at the requirement here in detail and clarify if it's applicable to you. And also if you are, let's say, quite close to the threshold and have certain fluctuations, then I would rather take a more cautious route and really think about, is this not maybe something that's applicable to our company?
We also always recommend to think about kind of key questions to ask yourself regarding the applicability. So maybe this is less on the employee number and more about distribution. So this is what we usually do with clients when they're not sure whether something applies to them, is that there's a number of kind of key questions that you can ask yourself when you look through the legislation that you can then take up with your legal department. Because ultimately the scope of application can also be a legal question that's important to be on the same page with your legal department. We've also had the question is whether we think human rights and environmental surveys throughout the supply chain would help to do due diligence.
Yeah, so so I think the question is always, if you take on a survey and for instance a questionnaire and distribute it throughout the supply chain, it may be one measure that you may want to apply to understand risks better, or also maybe to even go further into the prevention and of certain impacts. But I think one thing to always be cautious is about when there are questions about what are the appropriate measures. And I think one key aspect is that there is not usually one measure or also two measures that will help you address all of your relevant impacts. I think the longer the list of potential impacts and actual impact is that you need to address, and the more complex your supply chain is, the more sense it makes to think about the implementation of measures more as a toolbox that you apply. So to think about what are different measures that you may apply in different situations, depending on who is concerned, who is affected, depending on the severity, depending on where in your supply chain it is. So there are multiple factors that could really play into this. So surveys or questionnaires may be one option, but I would always be cautious about ultimate tools, and always think about all the tools and measures that you apply rather as a toolbox, and think about what's appropriate.
I think one of the key concepts here is always appropriate. That's mentioned also in the CSDDD regarding appropriate measure for each impact. So that's important to think about what measure fits the impact I've identified the most appropriately, and what fits my business appropriately. Maybe we can take one final question. And somebody is asking what we think are the main obstacles for the implementation of CSDDD.
I think those are, I think you answered it a little bit yourself. So I think probably you are even more of the experts on this from the company's perspective. So I think, if I remember correctly, in the first survey, a lot of you said that mapping out the chain of activities is a major challenge. Implementing the appropriate measure is a rather big challenge. And I think that those are maybe two of the bigger points, and they are also key points right in the beginning that you will have to address. So I think it's very important to have good methodologies, to have a very robust impact assessment right in the beginning, because it will help you later on also to find appropriate measures. It will also help you to define later on appropriate processes. So I think that's, from my perspective, one of the key things to be aware of. But it's not an obstacle that cannot be faced. So I think it's definitely something that everybody needs to get into, but something that we can definitely take a look at and conquer. So I think we are already at the limits of time. So we got some more questions. So we are not going to let your questions go to waste, but we will actually come back to you with the follow-up to this webinar, and also then take the opportunity to answer your questions. So if your question has not yet been answered, please look out for an email from our side and opportunity to talk more. So for now, actually, we would like to thank you very much for taking the time to participate today. If you want to stay up to date with everything that's going on and understand our latest insight, please subscribe to our newsletter. It also contains all the info on upcoming webinars and news outlets. And then I wish you a wonderful rest of the day, and looking forward to connecting with you soon. Thank you so much.